In the soft glow of a Brooklyn evening, the story begins not with power or fame, but with the hum of a foreign city and the quiet footsteps of a boy far from home. He was born in Haiti, in a land of rhythm, sun, and struggle, a place where families dreamed of something better beyond the sea. When his mother decided to leave everything behind for a new life in America, she carried only two things that truly mattered: her faith and her son. The year was the early 1970s, a time when New York's skyline promised opportunity but its streets offered something far different. For many immigrants, that first sight of the city was both a dream and a warning. The plane landed, and the cold hit him like a truth he wasn't ready to hear. Brooklyn was nothing like Port-au-Prince. Gone were the open markets, the scent of fried plantains, the chatter of Creole voices in the sun. Here, the air was thick with exhaust, and the streets echoed with sounds he didn't yet understand, English words sharp as knives, car horns, sirens, and the rhythmic pulse of music that came from every corner. It was a city that moved too fast, spoke too loud, and cared too little for a boy who didn't fit in. He was just another kid on the block at first, skinny, quiet, with eyes that watched everything. His family settled in East Flatbush, a neighborhood alive with energy but shadowed by poverty. The older boys ruled the corners, wearing confidence like armor, their sneakers spotless, their pockets full. He looked up to them the way a child might stare at a flame, fascinated, knowing it could burn. In school, his accent made him a target. Kids teased him for his broken English, for the way he dressed, for coming from a place they barely knew existed. He learned early that kindness was rare and that survival meant adapting fast. Each day became a lesson. He watched how the street taught people more than any classroom could, how to talk without showing fear, how to read danger in body language, how to know when to run. Every insult, every shove in the hallway, every night his mother prayed for safety, all of it carved something sharper in him. Slowly, the boy from Haiti became a young man with a Brooklyn edge. He didn't start out looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding those who refused to back down. There's something about growing up between two worlds that changes you. You never fully belong to either. In his heart, he was still the son of a Haitian mother, still tied to the warmth of his homeland, but his reflection in the mirror belonged to New York. The streets were molding him, pulling him towards something larger, something darker. He saw men make money fast, driving cars they couldn't afford, wearing gold chains heavy enough to remind everyone of their power. Respect was a currency, and he wanted some of it for himself. At night, when the city quieted and the sounds of the subway faded, he'd sometimes stand by his window and stare out over the streetlights. He wasn't dreaming of fame or fortune. He just wanted to be someone nobody could ignore. That hunger, that quiet, burning need to be seen, was the beginning of everything. But beneath the surface of his growing confidence, there was a loneliness that never left. He didn't yet understand that the same city teaching him strength was also teaching him distrust. Every friend could turn enemy, every promise could break. Those early years planted the idea that to survive, you must depend on no one but yourself. He didn't know it yet, but this belief would define his entire life. Brooklyn in the 1970s wasn't a playground, it was a battlefield dressed in concrete and neon. Crime was rising, drugs were spreading, and opportunity often came wrapped in danger. The local gangs began to notice him, not because he was violent, but because he was fearless. He didn't flinch when others did. He could talk his way out of fights, make people laugh, make others listen. It was the first sign of the charisma that would one day make him infamous. Still, he was just a kid. Walking home past flickering streetlights, his sneakers worn thin, his future unwritten. No one could have guessed that this quiet, observant boy from Haiti would one day be whispered about in nightclubs and rap lyrics. That he would move through the underworld and the music industry with the same ease. That his name would carry weight in rooms filled with men twice his age and power. For now, he was learning the first lesson of survival: if the world doesn't give you a place, you carve your own. It's in this quiet resilience, this calm before the storm, that his legend begins. A boy from Haiti, alone in Brooklyn, watching, listening, becoming. And though he couldn't know it yet, every street he walked, every fight he avoided, every name he remembered, all of it was shaping the man who would one day be known as Haitian Jack, the street legend who knew everyone and trusted no one. The years that followed would shape him in ways no one could predict. By the time the 1970s gave way to the early 80s, Brooklyn had become a living organism, loud, restless, and unforgiving. Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights, Flatbush, each neighborhood carried its own rhythm and its own code. To survive here meant more than just living, it meant understanding the invisible language of the streets. For the young Haitian immigrant, that meant learning how respect worked, how it could protect you one moment and destroy you the next. He wasn't the biggest kid on the block, but there was something in his eyes that made people think twice. A quiet, watching energy. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words cut through the noise. He was learning to blend in, to walk with purpose, to nod at the right people, to never stare too long. The corners were full of lessons, and the teachers didn't use books. They used fists, fear, and the kind of wisdom that could only come from pain. The first time he got into a real fight, it wasn't because he wanted to. It was because someone pushed him too far. He'd been mocked again for his accent, for being the Haitian kid. That day, something inside him refused to shrink back. He swung, fast and sharp, and though he took more hits than he gave, the message was sent, he wasn't going to be easy prey. From that day forward, people looked at him differently. He wasn't just another quiet kid anymore. He had earned something small but powerful, respect. Respect in Brooklyn didn't come from who you were, it came from how you handled yourself when no one else was watching. He began to move with more confidence, keeping his head high, his walk steady. The streets noticed. Older guys who once ignored him started nodding in acknowledgement. He wasn't one of them yet, but he was learning the first rule of survival: reputation is armor. You don't need to be the most dangerous, you just need people to think you could be. The block itself was a classroom. Every night, he'd sit on the stoop, watching how the older boys handled business. There were hustlers, gamblers, and men who never seemed to sleep. He learned the rhythms of their conversations, the coded talk, the exchanges that looked casual but weren't. He began to understand that in this world, knowledge was a kind of currency. You had to read people faster than they could read you. But survival wasn't just about toughness. It was about balance, knowing when to fight, when to talk, when to disappear. The young man who once struggled with English now used it like a weapon. His accent softened, his slang sharpened. He could slip between worlds, the immigrant community and the rougher edges of the city, without losing himself completely. That adaptability became his superpower. The 80s brought a new kind of energy to the borough. Music filled the air, hip-hop was being born in the same streets where violence never slept. Graffiti painted the walls like rebellion in color. Breakdancers spun on cardboard, radios blaring beats that spoke of survival, pride, and pain. He wasn't a musician, but he understood the rhythm of the streets, it matched the rhythm inside him. Every day was a test of how long you could keep moving before the city tried to swallow you whole. He had started running errands for older guys, small favors, quick deliveries, keeping watch during certain exchanges. Nothing big at first, but enough to make him feel part of something larger. Money started to appear in his pockets, crisp bills that spoke of freedom. The line between right and wrong began to blur. When you come from nothing, survival often looks like sin to those who've never been hungry. His mother still prayed for him every night, unaware of how close he stood to the edge. She'd leave a light on, whispering in Creole for God to guide her son. He loved her deeply, but he was beginning to understand a truth she could never accept, that faith alone couldn't protect him in Brooklyn. Out here, it wasn't God who made the rules. It was men with guns, names, and reputations that echoed through the blocks like warnings. Still, he kept his composure. He wasn't reckless, he was calculated. That was what separated him from the others. he didn't need to brag or show off. He watched, he learned, and when he acted, he did it with precision. That quiet discipline earned him something rare, trust. Older hustlers began to see him as dependable, a kid who kept his mouth shut and his eyes open. In a world where secrets meant survival, silence was worth more than gold. But with respect came attention, and with attention came danger. Rival groups started noticing him. Some saw potential, others saw threat. He was still young, but already his name was starting to circulate in whispers, nothing concrete, just curiosity about the Haitian kid who moved like he knew more than he should. That curiosity could open doors, or close them forever. At night, as he walked home through streets that smelled of smoke and summer rain, he could feel the city breathing around him. The neon signs flickered, the sounds of arguments and laughter blending into one restless hum. He didn't know it yet, but the boy who once fought to be respected was slowly becoming something else, someone others would one day fear, envy, and remember. Every legend starts small, one decision, one confrontation, one moment where survival becomes instinct. For him, that moment had already passed, though he didn't recognize it. He was no longer just adapting to Brooklyn, he was mastering it. The kid who arrived with nothing now walked the same blocks with the quiet authority of someone who belonged. He had learned the language of respect, the hard way. And in a city that devoured the weak, that lesson would carry him farther than anyone could imagine. By the late 1980s, Brooklyn was no longer just a neighborhood, it was an empire of survival. The streets pulsed with a dangerous rhythm, alive with ambition, fear, and addiction. Crack cocaine had arrived like a storm, flooding every block, turning ordinary corners into battlegrounds of wealth and ruin. The city glimmered with false promises, easy money, fast cars, gold chains that sparkled beneath flickering streetlights. It was a time when you could rise overnight, but just as easily disappear by morning. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos stood the young man from Haiti, sharper now, older, harder. The boy who once fought for respect was about to learn what power really meant. He had been watching, studying how the game worked. He knew who moved what, who collected where, and which corners paid the best. It wasn't just about drugs, it was about control, territory, image. Power wasn't always loud, sometimes it came in silence, in the way people stepped aside when you walked by. That was the power he wanted, the kind that didn't need to be announced. At first, his role was small. He handled errands, ran messages, kept watch during exchanges. But his reliability and sharp mind made him stand out. He understood how to move unseen, how to blend into crowds and yet always be aware of everything happening around him. Word spread quickly, the Haitian kid was solid, smart, and fearless. And in a world where trust was rare, being dependable was more valuable than being dangerous. But the streets were changing. Crack had made everything faster, the profits, the violence, the betrayals. Deals that once took days were now made in minutes, and every night seemed to bring new players chasing the same small slice of control. He adapted quickly, always staying one step ahead. He didn't need to be the biggest dealer, he just needed to be the one no one could outsmart. His instincts became his compass, guiding him through a landscape where one wrong word could mean death. He dressed the part, clean sneakers, designer jackets, gold jewelry that spoke without words. But behind the shine was calculation. He understood that image was armor. You had to look untouchable to be untouchable. He'd walk into clubs with a quiet confidence, not to flaunt, but to signal. Power, he realized, wasn't just what you had, it was what people thought you had. And he was mastering that illusion. The night scenes in Brooklyn were a blur of energy, music thumping from passing cars, hustlers laughing over dice games, the faint crackle of police radios in the distance. The city was alive and dangerous, and he thrived in it. He learned how to move money, how to read tension in a room, how to talk to people from every walk of life, drug dealers, club owners, even off-duty cops who turned a blind eye for the right price. He was building connections, one handshake at a time. Still, with opportunity came risk. Every deal could be a setup. Every new face might be a cop or a rival. The game rewarded paranoia, and he learned to keep his circle small. Trust no one completely, that rule had kept him alive since childhood, and now it became gospel. He began to see how easily loyalty crumbled under pressure, how friendships disappeared when bullets started flying. Violence became a constant backdrop. Gunshots were just another sound in the night, sharp, brief, and quickly forgotten. The funerals came often, faces of friends fading into memories. He started to understand that survival in this world wasn't about winning, it was about outlasting. And the only way to outlast was to stay unpredictable, untouchable, unbound. His operations grew quietly. He didn't draw attention, didn't flash too hard. He preferred to let others talk, while he observed. People began coming to him for advice, for connections. He became a broker of trust, the one who could get things done. And as his name spread, so did the myths. Stories about his composure under pressure, about his calm during chaos. Whether true or not didn't matter, the legend was forming, and he knew it. At home, though, the dual life weighed on him. His mother still believed he was working legitimate jobs, trying to build a future. He never corrected her. Maybe it was guilt, maybe protection. But every night before leaving, he'd look at her face and feel a flicker of conflict. Deep down, he knew that every dollar he earned brought him closer to the kind of man she feared he'd become. But it was too late to turn back. By 1988, he wasn't just surviving anymore, he was controlling pieces of the game. The immigrant kid who once stood on corners now owned them. He was connected to names that carried weight, people whose respect couldn't be bought with cash. They saw something in him, a blend of intelligence and ruthlessness that set him apart. And though he was still young, he moved like someone who had already seen too much. The city was devouring itself. The crack epidemic was tearing families apart, but for those in the underworld, it was a golden age. Money stacked fast, and the streets were full of self-made kings. He was one of them now, but he played it differently. He didn't crave fame. He craved influence. And influence meant access, to information, to people, to opportunities that others couldn't even see. He was learning to navigate a dangerous paradox: the more successful he became, the more enemies he made. Respect turned to envy. Admiration turned to suspicion. The balance between power and survival was razor thin, and he walked it with perfect calm. At night, while others celebrated, he stayed awake, calculating his next move. His ambition was silent but relentless, pushing him further from who he had been, closer to what he was destined to become. The Haitian boy who once fought for respect had evolved into something else entirely: a strategist, a businessman, a street philosopher. He understood that in Brooklyn, every choice was a gamble, and the only way to win was to never stop playing. The city had made him tough, the game had made him sharp, but it was his instincts that would make him a legend. And though he didn't yet know it, the same world that built him up was already preparing to test how much one man could truly endure. Power, once it begins to take shape, moves like smoke, slow at first, then unstoppable. By the early 1990s, the boy who had once walked Brooklyn's cracked sidewalks with wary eyes now moved through its streets with quiet command. He had built something intangible yet undeniable: a reputation. In neighborhoods where fear ruled and betrayal was currency, his name carried a kind of weight that made people straighten up when he passed. He didn't have an army, no official crew behind him, yet somehow, everyone seemed to answer when he spoke. Respect, once earned through fists and defiance, had evolved into something more sophisticated, a blend of fear, charisma, and mystery. He had learned that control wasn't about shouting or flexing muscles. It was about presence. When he entered a room, conversations softened. Eyes darted toward him, calculating, cautious. He never needed to announce who he was, the city already knew. That quiet authority made him both admired and feared. In the streets, stories about him began to grow, some true, some stretched by rumor. People said he could walk into any club in New York without paying, that he could talk a man out of anger or into loyalty with a single look. He was the kind of figure who blurred lines, part gentleman, part gangster, a man who could wear silk and steel in the same night. But every empire, even a silent one, needs a foundation. His was built not on chaos, but on discipline. He had rules, strict, almost ritualistic. Never act out of emotion. Never trust fully. Always stay one move ahead. To outsiders, it seemed like paranoia. To him, it was survival. He knew the streets could change direction overnight. One day, they love you, the next, they forget your name. He wasn't going to be another story buried by time. Money flowed easily now. He had hands in different hustles, small investments that kept his pockets full and his influence wide. Some nights he'd stand in the doorway of a nightclub, gold watch glinting under neon lights, watching the flow of people coming and going. The scene was his territory, even if he didn't own the building. Club owners respected him, promoters sought him out. His presence brought credibility, danger, and allure all at once. People wanted to be near him, but no one truly knew him. That was his genius. In a world built on fragile alliances, he understood that real power came from unpredictability. One night he'd buy everyone drinks, the next, he'd vanish without a word. He never let anyone think they had him figured out. That mystique made him untouchable. Even the police couldn't pin him down, he was too smart, too cautious. They heard his name whispered in investigations, but nothing stuck. Like smoke, he slipped through fingers every time they tried to grab him. Still, control always has a cost. The same fear that protected him also isolated him. He couldn't relax, not even among supposed friends. Every handshake was analyzed, every compliment measured for hidden motives. The paranoia that once kept him safe began to settle deep into his mind, turning into instinct. He slept lightly, his phone always within reach, his ear tuned to every sound outside his window. Power had made him untouchable, but it had also made him alone. Those who worked with him knew there were two sides to Haitian Jack. To the public, he was charm and confidence, a man who could light up a room with a story or a smile. To those inside his circle, he was all business. Every debt was remembered, every betrayal quietly handled. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make threats. His calmness was what made him dangerous. People feared what they couldn't read. And yet, he wasn't needlessly cruel. There was a strange morality to his actions, an old-school code buried beneath the street toughness. If someone showed loyalty, he rewarded it. If they crossed him, he never forgot. The line between friend and enemy was razor-thin, but he treated both with the same controlled respect, until they gave him a reason not to. It was this balance that kept him alive when others were falling one by one. The city was watching him now. Other hustlers whispered his name with a mix of envy and admiration. He was proof that you didn't need to be the loudest to be the most powerful. The police knew of him, but even they hesitated, too many connections, too many powerful acquaintances. Club owners, promoters, small-time dealers, all owed him something, even if they didn't realize it. He had turned reputation into currency. But power, once tasted, always demands more. He started to branch beyond the streets, curious about new worlds, places where money was cleaner, faces smoother, and power hid behind smiles instead of guns. The nightlife scene was changing, evolving into something glossier, more connected to fame and entertainment. He sensed opportunity there. In his mind, the next step wasn't about selling product, it was about selling influence. He could feel the pull toward something bigger, something that would connect him not just to hustlers and gangsters, but to stars and moguls. Yet deep inside, a quiet voice warned him. The same streets that had made him could just as easily destroy him. Power had a way of drawing enemies, and envy had a way of turning friends into threats. But he brushed off the thought, convincing himself he was different. Smarter. Untouchable. It was the illusion every king needed to sleep at night. As Brooklyn nights grew hotter, so did his reputation. He had become a ghost of influence, everywhere but nowhere, seen yet unseen. His name traveled faster than he did. And while the city's underworld bent slightly around his orbit, something new was coming. A connection that would change his path forever. The world of music was calling, and with it, a new kind of danger, one that couldn't be solved with a gun or silence, but with trust. And trust, for Haitian Jack, was the one thing he never truly had. Fame has its own kind of gravity, it pulls people together, but it also distorts everything it touches. When Haitian Jack first crossed paths with Tupac Shakur, it wasn't in the dark corners of the streets or the smoky rooms where deals were made. It was in the glittering, unpredictable world of hip-hop, where hustlers, artists, and dreamers collided under neon lights. The early 90s were a time when rap wasn't just music, it was revolution, rebellion, and identity. And for a man like Haitian Jack, who had already mastered survival in chaos, this new world felt familiar yet dangerous in a different way. Tupac was rising fast, charismatic, poetic, and fiery. His fame was magnetic, and the world was drawn to his rawness. But behind that brilliance was vulnerability, the kind that the streets could sense. Jack recognized it immediately. He saw in Tupac a younger version of himself, a man caught between two worlds, trying to prove his strength while searching for trust. Their connection came naturally, almost fated. To outsiders, it seemed like an odd pairing, the philosopher-rapper and the calculating street figure. But together, they formed a bond built on mutual respect and survival instinct. New York nights began to blend into a rhythm, clubs, parties, and backroom conversations. Haitian Jack became a familiar face in the hip-hop scene, often standing beside Pac, both men exuding an aura of danger and magnetism. They shared laughs, traded war stories, and watched each other's backs. Jack admired Tupac's boldness, Pac admired Jack's composure. For a brief time, they were inseparable, brothers in spirit, navigating fame and fear side by side. But fame, like power, changes people. As Tupac's stardom exploded, the people around him began to shift. There were record label politics, rivalries, and jealous eyes. The line between art and street life blurred. Tupac wasn't just making music, he was making enemies, loudly. Haitian Jack, who had spent his life mastering silence and subtlety, began to feel uneasy. He tried to warn Pac, reminding him that not every smile was sincere, that every room had ears. But Tupac's fire was uncontrollable, he was too passionate, too proud to see the traps being laid around him. There's an old rule in the underworld, when the money and attention start flowing, loyalty starts leaking. The parties that once felt safe began to carry tension. Whispers about deals gone wrong, people getting too close to law enforcement, money missing from hands it was promised to, it all started to poison the air. Jack, ever the strategist, began to pull back slightly, watching from a distance. He didn't want to get caught in anyone else's storm. But no matter how careful he was, the spotlight had already linked him to Pac, and with it came scrutiny he hadn't asked for. Their friendship took a darker turn when the lines of loyalty blurred. Accusations began to surface, small at first, then louder. People in Pac's circle began whispering things, that Jack was manipulating him, that he wasn't to be trusted. The rumors spread like wildfire through the industry, amplified by jealousy and misunderstanding. Jack, for his part, stayed quiet. He had always believed silence was the best weapon. But Tupac was different. He spoke from emotion, from pain. What might have been settled in private became public, feeding the media's hunger for drama. There was still genuine care between them, but it was laced with distrust now. Jack could feel the shift in Pac's tone, the hesitation in his words. What once felt like brotherhood now felt like a chess game, every move observed, every word measured. The city began to talk, about the two men, about betrayal, about power plays behind the music. Jack hated gossip, but he knew better than to ignore it. In this world, perception was often deadlier than truth. Behind the glitz of studio lights and the chaos of paparazzi flashes, the tension grew. Jack tried to maintain his composure, reminding himself that this was what happened when the streets met fame, miscommunication, pride, and paranoia. He'd seen it before, and he knew how it ended. But there was something about this one that felt heavier, like a storm that couldn't be avoided. And then came the night everything changed. An incident, violent, messy, and fueled by ego, would alter the course of both their lives. It was the kind of night that starts with laughter and ends with sirens. Jack's name would soon be tied to headlines he never wanted. He knew the media wouldn't tell his side, they'd paint him as the shadowy figure behind the chaos, the mysterious, street guy, who had led a star astray. For Haitian Jack, it was déjà vu, the streets had their own kind of betrayal, but fame was worse. Fame didn't stab you in the dark, it put your name in bold letters and called it truth. As the headlines grew, so did the distance between him and Pac. Two men who once shared trust were now separated by suspicion and public judgment. In private moments, Jack would think back to those early days, the laughter, the mutual respect, the sense that they both understood what it meant to survive in a world that didn't forgive weakness. Now, that bond was fractured, and the world was watching. The streets he once ruled with quiet control had turned on him, fueled by rumors and resentment. And yet, beneath the tension, there was still a strange connection between them, one that neither could fully erase. They were both products of survival, both haunted by trust. In another life, maybe they could have remained brothers. But in this one, fame had turned loyalty into legend, and legend into poison. Trouble in the world of fame rarely arrives as a storm. It begins as a whisper, a look that lasts too long, a word spoken in the wrong room, a question that no one answers directly. For Haitian Jack, the shift was slow but unmistakable. The friendship that had once brought him into the glamorous, chaotic orbit of hip-hop's elite was now turning into a spotlight he couldn't escape. The name, Haitian Jack, had started appearing in conversations that made him uneasy. There was talk, accusations that carried weight, and stories that twisted truth into theater. It all came to a head with one event, the night that would mark him in history not as a legend of the streets, but as a villain in someone else's story. In 1994, the air in New York was thick with tension. The rap scene was exploding, money, fame, and power were mixing dangerously. And within that chaos, an incident involving Tupac Shakur changed everything. What began as a night of celebration would end in confusion, betrayal, and handcuffs. The details have been debated endlessly, each retelling colored by bias, pain, or politics. But what's undeniable is this: the night spiraled out of control. In the aftermath, Tupac accused Haitian Jack of betrayal, claiming that Jack had set him up. To the public, it became a scandal that blurred the line between rumor and reality. Suddenly, Jack wasn't just a quiet figure in the background, he was the man at the center of hip-hop's most talked-about controversy. For Jack, it was surreal. One moment, he was respected in both the streets and the industry, the next, he was being painted as a villain in headlines and interviews. The same people who once called him brother were now avoiding his calls. Even those who knew better stayed silent, self-preservation, the oldest rule of survival. Jack wasn't new to betrayal, but this was different. This wasn't the street turning against him. It was fame itself. He tried to move cautiously, speaking only to those he trusted completely. He knew better than to lash out publicly. Every word spoken in defense would only feed the fire. Instead, he waited, watching how quickly people changed when the heat turned up. It was almost fascinating to him, how fast loyalty could dissolve under the pressure of headlines and police interest. He'd seen fear before, but never like this, fear wrapped in suits, microphones, and television lights. The legal system soon followed. Jack found himself facing charges, surrounded by lawyers and flashing cameras. It was a world far more treacherous than the streets he had mastered. In the underworld, betrayal came with warning signs. In courtrooms, it came dressed in procedure and politeness. The case was complex, layered with contradictions and conflicting accounts. Jack maintained his composure through it all, refusing to break character. To him, showing emotion meant giving the enemy power. The media, however, wasn't interested in nuance. They wanted a villain. And in Haitian Jack, they found the perfect one, a mysterious, foreign-born hustler with connections to celebrities and criminals alike. He became a caricature in the press, the dangerous figure behind the scenes, the man who corrupted innocence. It didn't matter that much of it was exaggeration. Once an image is planted in the public's mind, it grows on its own. Behind closed doors, the stress was enormous. Jack could feel the walls closing in, not just from law enforcement but from isolation. Those who once respected him now whispered behind his back. He'd walk into rooms and feel conversations pause. The very charisma that once drew people to him now made them nervous. Power had transformed into poison. He spent long nights alone, thinking about how it had all unfolded. Was it bad luck? Betrayal? Fate? He had always prided himself on control, on being the man who never let his emotions dictate his actions. But now he was dealing with something far beyond the streets, a system that didn't play by the rules he understood. The courtroom wasn't a battlefield where strength and strategy mattered. It was a theater of perception. And perception, he was learning, was deadlier than any bullet. Even as the legal process dragged on, Jack refused to break down. He leaned on discipline, the same principles that had carried him through darker times. Never show weakness. Never beg. Never explain more than necessary. He focused on surviving the moment, trusting that time would eventually reveal the truth, or at least dull the lies. Yet deep inside, something changed. A quiet bitterness began to form, a realization that loyalty in this world was fleeting. He had once thought that his respect in the streets would protect him, that reputation was armor. But now, he saw that fame and power could turn even friends into liabilities. The world he'd built his life around was shifting beneath his feet. The worst part wasn't the case itself, it was the silence. The people he'd helped, protected, or guided over the years had vanished. In their place was distance and denial. That was when he truly understood the cost of fame. It didn't destroy you overnight. It eroded you slowly, until even your reflection felt like a stranger. When the trial finally ended, Jack emerged with scars that weren't visible but ran deep. His name had been dragged through mud, his reputation fractured. Though he still walked the same streets, something inside him had hardened. The world saw him as a story, a cautionary tale, or worse, a villain. But he saw himself as something else entirely, a survivor. He understood now that survival in this new world wasn't about guns or territory. It was about silence, timing, and resilience. The streets had taught him how to fight. The system had taught him how to endure. And endurance, he realized, was the ultimate form of revenge. When the noise of scandal finally began to fade, Haitian Jack was left standing in the quiet aftermath, a man both famous and infamous, depending on who was telling the story. The headlines had moved on, the public had found new villains to chase, but the damage lingered. Reputation, once his greatest weapon, had turned into a shadow that followed him everywhere. He could feel it when he walked into rooms, see it in the way people looked away too quickly or leaned in to whisper. The world hadn't forgotten his name, it had simply changed what that name meant. But if there was one thing Jack had learned, it was that the streets always offered second chances to those patient enough to wait for them. The city, cold and unfeeling, had short memories when money was involved. And money, Jack's old, reliable ally, was still within reach. He knew better than to try to reclaim fame or force respect. Respect, he'd always said, wasn't something you shouted about, it was something you rebuilt in silence. He began to move differently now, quietly, deliberately. No more crowded nightclubs, no more photos with famous faces. He returned to what he knew best, the art of control. While others sought validation through attention, Jack understood that real power was found in invisibility. He became a ghost of influence again, operating in the margins, avoiding unnecessary attention. Those who truly knew the game could still feel his presence, whispered references, small nods and conversations that never made it past closed doors. But the scars of betrayal had left their mark. Trust, already scarce in his life, became something he treated like an antique, valuable but too fragile to use. Even casual friendships were now filtered through suspicion. Every favor came with calculation, every handshake with a hidden question. He'd seen too much to believe in sincerity anymore. In the calm moments between moves, he'd sit alone, thinking about how different things could have been if trust hadn't been such a dangerous thing to offer. Despite his isolation, Jack's intuition remained sharp. He could sense when danger was near, feel the tension in the air before it arrived. That gift had saved him countless times, and it would again. Because even though he had pulled back from the spotlight, others hadn't forgotten the power he once held, or the grudges that came with it. Some saw his retreat as weakness, others mistook his silence for surrender. They didn't realize that silence was his strategy. He was rebuilding, quietly, like a man sharpening a knife in the dark. The mid-1990s in New York were changing fast. The streets had evolved, new faces, new codes, new threats. The old-world structure of loyalty and hierarchy was breaking down, replaced by chaos and desperation. The younger generation didn't respect the old rules anymore. They were louder, flashier, reckless. Jack watched it all with detached amusement. He had survived the streets at their most brutal. This new generation, he thought, wouldn't last long. But still, the instability made him uneasy. Chaos had a way of dragging even the careful down with it. He started thinking about leaving, about what it would mean to walk away before the streets took what was left of him. But leaving wasn't easy. The city wasn't just a place for him, it was a part of his blood, a rhythm that his heart beat to. Every corner, every neon reflection held memories of who he had been. Still, there was a pull deep inside him, a whisper that told him to disappear before the next storm hit. And storms were always coming. He had made enemies, some known, some faceless. Rivalries that had once been muted by fear were starting to surface again. The balance of power was shifting. Where once he could rely on alliances and mutual respect, now he saw only opportunists and imitators. Everyone wanted to be the next Haitian Jack, but none had the discipline or patience. They mistook recklessness for courage. So, he stayed alert but calm, waiting. He had mastered patience long ago. If others wanted to burn out quickly, he would simply watch the fire from a distance. There was something poetic about survival in his world. It wasn't about winning, not really. It was about outlasting. And Jack, despite everything, was still standing. He spent more time in reflection now, remembering how easily loyalty had turned to betrayal, how fame had twisted truth. In the silence, he found something close to peace, though it wasn't the comforting kind. It was a cold, clear understanding of the world as it truly was. There were no heroes here, no real friends. Just people playing their parts until the curtain fell. Sometimes, late at night, he'd walk alone through the same Brooklyn streets where it had all started. The city felt different now, cleaner in some places, colder in others. He'd pass by clubs that once pulsed with his presence, now filled with strangers who had no idea whose footsteps had echoed there before. That anonymity felt strange but freeing. For the first time in years, no one was watching him. He could breathe. Still, a part of him missed the power, the way people had once looked at him, the way doors opened without him asking. But he also knew the cost of that life. Power demanded paranoia. Fame demanded sacrifice. And he was tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from sleepless nights, but from carrying the weight of too many memories. In those quiet walks, he began to realize something profound: survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about letting go of the version of yourself that the world tried to destroy. The streets had made him hard, but they hadn't taken his mind. As long as he could think, plan, and adapt, he would always find a way. And so, Haitian Jack began his silent reinvention, not as a legend, not as a villain, but as a survivor reshaping his destiny. The world thought his story was ending, but for Jack, it was only changing shape. He was no longer interested in proving anything. Now, it was about one thing only: freedom. Freedom is a strange thing for a man like Haitian Jack. For most of his life, freedom had meant movement, the ability to go where he wanted, to act without asking, to be untouchable in a world that thrived on fear. But now, in the late 1990s, freedom began to take on a new shape. It wasn't about running the streets or commanding respect. It was quieter, almost invisible. Freedom meant peace. And peace, for a man who had spent years living on adrenaline, was the hardest thing to find. The noise of the city no longer excited him the way it used to. The bright lights of New York, once symbols of energy and power, had begun to feel suffocating. Everywhere he went, his name carried a shadow of its past, an unspoken tension that followed him like smoke. There were still people who respected him, still places that welcomed him. But the energy had changed. The streets that had once felt alive now seemed colder, filled with new faces chasing dreams they didn't understand. Jack watched them with quiet detachment, recognizing the same hunger he once had, knowing how quickly it could devour them. He began to spend more time away from the noise. Some nights, he'd drive without direction, no destination, no plan, just the hum of the engine and the city lights fading behind him. He was searching for something, though he couldn't yet name it. Maybe redemption. Maybe anonymity. Maybe just a moment without the constant echo of his own reputation. Despite his efforts to distance himself, the world wouldn't let him go easily. The legal troubles, the rumors, the stories, they still circled. Every few months, someone would bring his name up again, often in connection to Tupac's death, as though history couldn't move on without him. It was frustrating, how the truth had been buried beneath myth. He hadn't been there when it happened, hadn't played the part the media imagined for him. But once a story is written, it becomes almost impossible to rewrite. Jack had always believed in perception as power. Now, he was on the other side of it, trapped inside an image he hadn't created but couldn't escape. He tried to ignore it, but deep down, it gnawed at him. He wanted to be remembered as a survivor, not a shadow. Still, he knew that trying to defend his name would only feed the narrative. So, he stayed silent. Silence had always been his weapon, and now it was his shield. He started to think about the world beyond New York. The city had been both his kingdom and his cage, and he felt its walls closing in. There were whispers that he was being watched again, by law enforcement, by rivals, maybe even by ghosts of the past. Paranoia had become part of his DNA, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't the kind that made him reach for a gun. It was the kind that made him plan for escape. Jack began laying the groundwork quietly. He sold off connections, distanced himself from familiar places, tied up loose ends. He moved through the city like a man erasing his own footprints. The few people he trusted didn't understand what he was doing, but they didn't question him either. They knew better. When Haitian Jack made moves, it was always for a reason. As the world of hip-hop descended deeper into violence and division, East Coast versus West Coast, brother versus brother, Jack felt the darkness closing in. Tupac's death had shattered something in the culture, a sense of invincibility that everyone once shared. To Jack, it was a brutal reminder of how quickly fame could turn fatal. He mourned in his own way, silently, without words. Whatever their differences had been, Tupac had once been like family to him. And now, another piece of his past was gone. After the morning came reflection. Jack began to think about what legacy really meant. Not the kind that got written about in magazines, but the kind that lasted in memory, the stories people told in quiet rooms, away from cameras. He wondered if anyone would remember him for his intelligence, his discipline, his refusal to be broken. Or if he'd forever be known as the man in the shadows of someone else's tragedy. There's a kind of loneliness that comes when a man outlives his legend. Jack was feeling it now. He had lived through more than most, betrayal, survival, reinvention, and yet the world still saw him as a story, not a person. Some nights, he'd sit by the window, city lights flickering in the distance, and think about the faces that had come and gone. Friends who had vanished, rivals who had fallen, allies who had switched sides when the tides changed. The ghosts were endless. But within that loneliness was a strange kind of peace. He no longer needed to prove anything. The constant chase for power, respect, or redemption, all of it felt small now. He had seen how fragile those things were. The real victory, he realized, was still being alive when everyone else had burned out. Survival was the quietest form of revenge, and he was still standing. Then came the decision that would change everything. He knew it was time to leave. Time to disappear. Not because he was running, but because he was finally ready to live without the weight of his past. The United States had given him both his rise and his downfall. Now, he wanted distance, real distance. Somewhere his name meant nothing, where he could wake up and not be defined by stories told by others. The decision wasn't made in a moment of fear. It was calm, methodical. The way he had approached everything in life. He made the necessary calls, secured the papers, and prepared for a move that few even knew about. The man who had once ruled the nightclubs and whispered networks of New York was about to vanish into the wider world. And as he packed the last of his things, Jack took one last look at the skyline, a city that had made him a legend and nearly destroyed him. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He simply nodded to himself, as if acknowledging a long, complicated love story. The city had taught him everything, how to fight, how to fear, how to survive. But now, it was time to learn something new, how to let go. Cuba was unlike anywhere Haitian Jack had ever been. The moment he stepped off the plane, the air itself felt different, thicker, slower, filled with the scent of salt, tobacco, and something unnameable, like freedom that had learned to live behind walls. The island was both beautiful and broken, a paradise built from the bones of struggle. To Jack, it felt strangely familiar. In the rhythm of the streets, the laughter of men playing dominoes under faded murals of revolution, he saw reflections of the world he had come from, people who survived by wit, charm, and the unspoken code of the hustle. At first, his plan had been simple: stay quiet, stay unseen, build a new life. He rented a small house on the outskirts of Havana, away from the noise, near the water. Days blended into nights, and for the first time in years, he wasn't watching his back every second. The paranoia that had once defined him began to fade, replaced by something softer, almost peaceful. But men like Jack don't just disappear. Even in exile, his name carried weight. Word traveled quickly in underground circles: a legend had arrived on the island, a ghost from the old American streets. The locals were curious. Some treated him with respect, others with caution. There were whispers in the bars, stories told in hushed tones about the man who had once run with the biggest names in hip-hop, who had outsmarted the law and lived to tell about it. Jack never confirmed or denied any of it. He preferred silence. In Cuba, mystery was currency, and he had more of it than anyone else. The island had its own underworld, and it didn't take long for Jack to see how it worked. Black markets, quiet deals, government eyes that saw everything but pretended not to. He moved carefully, never too deep, never too visible. The old instincts were still there, the ability to read a room, to sense danger before it arrived, to make friends without trusting anyone. It was a delicate balance, and he played it perfectly. But as months turned into years, something inside him began to shift. The adrenaline that had once kept him alive was no longer a necessity. He started to enjoy the simple things: morning walks along the Malecon, the smell of coffee in the humid air, the sound of distant music floating from open windows. It was strange how easily he could fade into this life. No fame, no chaos, no threats. Just existence. Still, the past had a way of echoing. Sometimes, late at night, when the streets went quiet and the waves crashed against the rocks, memories would come back. Faces. Voices. Tupac's laughter. The sound of New York traffic. The smell of gunpowder and sweat in dimly lit clubs. It wasn't guilt that haunted him, it was memory. The kind that never really leaves, no matter how far you run. People back in the States had started to forget him, or at least, they thought they had. His name would still appear in interviews, documentaries, or internet threads, always tied to controversy, always half myth. But Jack didn't care anymore. For the first time in his life, he wasn't defined by anyone else's version of him. He was just another man living under the Caribbean sun, aging quietly, surviving privately. Some said he found a new kind of business in Cuba. Nothing big, nothing reckless, just enough to keep him comfortable. He had learned that power didn't always come from noise, sometimes it came from stillness. Connections were made through trust, not fear. He became known not as the gangster or the menace, but as the man who could make things happen quietly, efficiently, without attention. Respect, once born from fear, was now built on calm authority. Jack didn't talk much about America. When people asked, he'd shrug, smile, and say, that chapter's closed. But deep down, he knew America had never really left him. It lived in the rhythm of his speech, in the instincts that woke him up before dawn, in the way he scanned every room before sitting down. You don't unlearn a life like that, you just learn to carry it differently. Sometimes he'd see tourists from New York, their accents sharp and familiar, their clothes bright and loud. They reminded him of a world that no longer belonged to him. He'd watch from a distance, a ghost observing the living. There was a strange comfort in being invisible. No one expected anything from him. No one wanted anything. He had finally found the peace that power could never give. But peace came with a price: isolation. There were no real friends here, only acquaintances. Conversation stayed surface level. Trust was still a rare currency. The loneliness that once haunted him in New York followed him even to this island of sunlight and revolution. He had traded chaos for calm, but calm could be just as suffocating when you had spent your whole life running on fire. In the quiet of his Havana home, Jack would sometimes sit with a glass of rum, listening to the crackle of an old radio. News from the world outside would drift in: wars, politics, music, death. Every now and then, he'd hear Tupac's voice on the airwaves, one of those timeless tracks that refuse to die. It always hit him differently out here. The anger, the poetry, the pain, it all felt distant now, like a message from a ghost to another ghost. And yet, despite everything, he felt gratitude. He had escaped the fate of so many who came before him. He wasn't dead, wasn't locked away. He was free in a way that most men from his world never got to be. No headlines, no betrayals, no bullets. Just silence. In the end, that's what Cuba gave him, a final chapter written in quiet ink. Not redemption, not forgiveness, but endurance. He had lived through the rise and fall of empires, both musical and criminal. He had watched legends die and reputations rot. And yet, here he was, breathing, surviving, existing. If the streets had taught him anything, it was that the real gangsters weren't the ones who made the most noise, they were the ones who endured. And in that sense, Haitian Jack had outlasted them all. Rumors have a way of traveling faster than truth, especially in the streets, where myth often becomes more powerful than memory. For Haitian Jack, even in exile, his name was far from forgotten. In New York, whispers about him drifted through smoky backrooms, barber shops, and late-night radio shows. Some said he had died in Cuba. Others claimed he was still pulling strings from the shadows, orchestrating moves with the same precision he once showed in the clubs of Brooklyn. His legend had taken on a life of its own, part fact, part fable, a story retold by those who needed a ghost to explain the things they couldn't see. What people didn't understand was that legends are often born from silence. Jack had disappeared from the public eye, but that absence only magnified his myth. Every rapper, every hustler, every wannabe gangster wanted to claim a piece of his story. They'd drop his name in lyrics, documentaries, and interviews, painting him as the man who knew everyone and trusted no one. And maybe that was true. But beneath the street tales and half-truths, the real Jack was just living quietly, watching the world from afar. In Cuba, he'd hear pieces of these stories through the few American contacts he still trusted. Someone would show him a magazine clipping, a YouTube video, or a podcast episode. His face, his name, his story, still circulating, still misunderstood. Sometimes he laughed at what he heard. Other times, he'd go quiet, eyes distant. "They don't know," he'd say softly. "They weren't there." But every lie carried a fragment of truth, and every exaggeration came from a seed of reality. The truth was, Jack had been close to power, too close, perhaps. He had walked the fine line between fame and danger, loyalty and betrayal. His story had all the ingredients that made people obsessed: crime, money, music, mystery. He wasn't just part of hip-hop's golden era, he was one of the invisible architects behind it, the man who had shaped deals and defined reputations without ever needing a microphone. In New York's underground circles, his reputation had become untouchable. Jack was different, they'd say. He didn't talk much, but when he did, you listened. That kind of power, the power of silence, of respect earned rather than demanded, was rare. And as time passed, it only grew stronger. Even younger generations who had never met him spoke his name like an urban legend. Meanwhile, in the quiet warmth of Havana, Jack was far removed from it all. But the past always found its way to his door. One day, a young filmmaker from the States showed up, hoping to do a documentary about the real Haitian Jack. He had tracked Jack down through a friend of a friend, a trail of whispers that led him to a bar near the ocean. Jack agreed to meet, not out of vanity, but curiosity. They sat at a small table as the waves crashed in the background. The filmmaker asked questions, about Tupac, about the streets, about everything people had wondered for years. Jack answered carefully, every word measured, his tone calm. "You want the truth," he said finally. "The truth is, people don't really want the truth. They want a story." The filmmaker pressed him for details, but Jack deflected with ease. Some questions got a half smile, others a shake of the head. When the man asked about Tupac's shooting, Jack's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened slightly. "That's between me and God," he said. It wasn't a confession, nor a denial. It was simply a closing of a door that had never truly been opened. After the meeting, the filmmaker left with more questions than answers, but that was exactly how Jack preferred it. Mystery had protected him for decades, it had become his greatest weapon. Every unanswered question turned into a rumor, and every rumor turned into legacy. In the world Jack came from, invisibility wasn't weakness, it was survival. Back in the States, the myth of Haitian Jack continued to evolve. Rappers name-dropped him as a symbol of street authenticity. Documentaries painted him as a shadowy figure who influenced the biggest moments in hip-hop history. Interviews with old associates added layers to his legend, each one more dramatic than the last. Some called him a manipulator. Others, a mentor. Some said he was ruthless. Others claimed he was misunderstood. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in between. Jack never corrected them. To chase the truth would be to step back into a world he had already escaped. Instead, he watched from a distance as his legend grew beyond his control. There was something almost poetic about it. The man who once lived in the spotlight now ruled from the shadows, without even trying. Sometimes, when the Cuban nights grew long and the streets were silent, he'd reflect on it all. How strange it was to be both famous and forgotten, feared and admired, alive yet mythologized. The irony wasn't lost on him. "They'll turn you into whatever suits their story," he'd mutter to himself. "And when you stop talking, they'll talk for you." He had learned to let them. Because in the end, what mattered wasn't what they said, it was what he knew. The real story, the unspoken details, the moments that never made it into interviews or songs, those belonged to him alone. And maybe that was his quiet revenge against the world that had tried to define him. To remain a mystery. To stay untouchable. To leave behind a legacy that no one could truly own. In that way, Haitian Jack had achieved something rare in the history of crime and fame. He had outlived his reputation, outsmarted his enemies, and outlasted his myths. The streets remembered him one way, the industry another, but the man himself existed somewhere far beyond both, half a world away, watching it all unfold like a movie he had already seen. Years passed quietly in Cuba, and Haitian Jack began to feel the subtle erosion of time. His hair, once neatly lined and jet black, began to silver around the edges. His eyes still carried that sharpness, the kind that could read danger in a heartbeat, but they softened when he looked out across the sea. The ocean became his companion, a living mirror of his own contradictions, calm on the surface, unpredictable beneath. There was a peace to it, but also a melancholy. The streets that had once defined him were now a memory, distant but still pulsing somewhere deep inside. Jack had lived 1,000 lives before reaching this point. He had been the street hustler, the feared enforcer, the industry insider, and now, the exile. But exile has a strange way of turning into reflection. When you strip away the noise, the titles, the power, all that's left is the man himself. And for the first time in decades, Jack had the time to think, to truly think, about who he had been and what it had all meant. Most men from his world didn't get that luxury. They either died young or spent their last days behind bars. Jack had escaped both fates, but that didn't mean he was free of ghosts. They followed him in silence. Faces from the past, deals gone wrong, moments that changed the course of entire lives. Sometimes, when the night grew heavy and Havana's lights shimmered against the sea, he'd pour himself a glass of rum and sit by the window, replaying the old days like scenes from a film he could never quite turn off. He thought about the people who had come and gone, friends who became enemies, enemies who became stories. He thought about Tupac, about how everything had spiraled so fast, about how a simple misunderstanding in the wrong world could turn deadly. "If I could go back," he once murmured to a bartender who had become a silent listener over the years, "I'd still play the game. But I'd play it smarter. Quieter." The bartender didn't respond, he just poured another drink. There was a rhythm to Jack's days now. Mornings began with quiet walks along the Malecon, afternoons spent in shade, evenings filled with music and memory. Sometimes, the locals would gather near his neighborhood, unaware of who he really was. They'd play dominoes, tell jokes, and gossip about small island matters. Jack would watch from a distance, smiling faintly. There was beauty in their simplicity, a kind of innocence the streets had taken from him long ago. Yet even in his solitude, the old instincts never fully died. Whenever a stranger asked too many questions, or a car lingered too long outside his street, the chill of paranoia returned. He'd retreat, close doors, vanish for days if he had to. It wasn't fear, it was discipline. Survival had become second nature. Trust, once his deadliest weakness, was now a luxury he no longer entertained. Still, there were rare nights when he'd let his guard down. A small group of Cuban friends would gather at his place, men who had never known the American Jack, only the quiet version who blended into the island's rhythm. They'd talk about everything from politics to love, from music to loss. Jack didn't speak much, but when he did, the others listened closely. His words carried the weight of a man who had lived through storms. Life, he told them once, ain't about being the loudest man in the room. It's about being the last one standing when everyone else is gone. The wisdom in his voice came from scars, some visible, most invisible. Every lesson had been paid for in loyalty, betrayal, or blood. He knew that beneath every street legend lay a trail of sacrifices that no one ever saw. And maybe that's why Jack had stopped trying to defend his name. The world would believe whatever version of him it wanted to. But the truth? That was something he kept locked inside, guarded as fiercely as his life once was. As time passed, small ripples from the outside world would occasionally disturb his quiet existence. News reached him that Suge Knight had gone to prison. Old associates were gone, some buried, others forgotten. Hip-hop had evolved, the culture shifting into something unrecognizable. But Jack had no bitterness. He viewed it all like an elder watching the next generation of soldiers take the field. Different era, he'd mutter. Same hunger. In Havana, he had become something of an enigma, a man respected by those who barely knew him, feared by those who knew too much. Some whispered he had government connections. Others thought he was just an old hustler living out his days in peace. The truth was simpler, he was tired. Not in body, but in soul. A lifetime of surviving takes more from you than bullets ever could. One afternoon, a rainstorm swept across the city. Jack sat by the window, watching water cascade down the glass. He thought about his mother, his childhood, the island he had left as a boy, the country that had both made and betrayed him. He realized that his entire life had been a cycle of departures, always leaving, always escaping, but never truly arriving anywhere. Maybe this is where I was supposed to end up, he said softly to himself. A man with no country, no crew, no noise. But even in his quiet acceptance, there was pride. Few men could say they had walked through fire and come out the other side. Fewer still could do it and keep their souls intact. Haitian Jack wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a villain. He was something more complicated, a man who had lived by his own rules and survived every consequence they brought. That night, as the rain eased and the air cooled, Jack stepped outside. The streets were empty, slick with water. He lit a cigarette and looked up at the Cuban sky. It was the same sky that hung over New York, over Haiti, over every place he had ever been. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to peace, not the peace of innocence, but the peace of endurance. The kind that comes when a man finally stops running, not because he's tired, but because he's learned that the world can't chase him forever. The years continued to drift by like smoke, slow, shapeless, and full of echoes. Havana had become home, though Haitian Jack would never have called it that out loud. Home, to him, was never a place. It was a feeling, one that had long since disappeared somewhere between the cracked sidewalks of Brooklyn and the broken loyalties of Los Angeles. Yet, as time passed, he began to understand that the peace he had found on this island wasn't just survival. It was transformation. There was an unspoken beauty in the way life slowed down here. Mornings came with the sound of roosters and distant laughter. Old men played dominoes under the shade of palm trees, and children ran barefoot through narrow alleys, chasing dreams that didn't yet know the weight of reality. Jack watched them sometimes, a faint smile on his face, as if seeing a version of himself long forgotten, a boy before the streets taught him how cruel the world could be. In Cuba, time had no urgency. It didn't demand that he prove himself, didn't chase him with flashing lights or whispered betrayals. It simply let him exist. And in that stillness, Jack began to rediscover the parts of himself that the streets had buried. He started reading again, old philosophy books, crime novels, anything that spoke to men who lived between light and shadow. He wrote occasionally too, not for anyone else, but for himself. Fragments of memory, reflections, lessons learned through pain. The handwriting was rough, but the thoughts were sharp. Some nights, when the wind carried music through his open window, he'd sit by the radio and listen to the world beyond the island. Hip-hop had changed, its sound, its purpose, its energy. The names were different, the style new, but the hunger was the same. The desire to rise, to be remembered, to escape the gravity of poverty and insignificance. It was a hunger Jack knew too well. He had lived it, bled for it, watched it consume people he once called brothers. Every now and then, his name would resurface in those songs, spoken by rappers who had never met him, who only knew the myth. Haitian Jack this, Haitian Jack that. He'd smile, shake his head, and say quietly, "They still talking." There was a strange comfort in knowing that his story, however distorted, still lived on. Even as he faded into the background of history, the legend refused to die. But the legend wasn't the man. The real Jack lived simply now. No entourage, no bodyguards, no noise. He'd spend mornings walking to the local cafe, greeting the same faces, sipping thick Cuban coffee, reading the same worn newspapers. The locals called him El Extranjero Tranquilo, the quiet foreigner. To them, he was just another older man who carried himself with quiet dignity, who never asked for attention but somehow drew it wherever he went. Yet even in tranquility, there was tension beneath the surface. Jack's mind remained sharp, always scanning, always reading situations. He could sense when someone new had entered the neighborhood, could tell when a conversation shifted tones around him. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct, honed by decades of survival. Old habits never truly die, they just learn to live in silence. Occasionally, word from the outside world would find him, a letter from an old contact, a message passed discreetly through someone traveling from Miami or the Dominican Republic. The streets, it seemed, were still alive with stories of him. Some said he had money hidden overseas. Others claimed he was quietly running things from Cuba. None of it was true, but Jack never bothered to correct them. The myth served a purpose. It kept people guessing, kept them distant. There were moments, however, when that myth brought danger. Once, a young man arrived from Miami, bold and reckless, claiming he wanted to do business. Jack could see the ambition in his eyes, the same hunger he'd once carried. The young man talked about loyalty, about making moves, about restoring Jack's name in the game. Jack listened silently, his expression unreadable. When the man finished, Jack leaned back, took a slow drag from his cigarette, and said, "If you're lucky, you'll live long enough to realize that loyalty is just another word people use before they betray you." The man didn't come back. Moments like that reminded Jack that peace wasn't a permanent state, it was something you protected, like a fragile flame. Too much attention, too many words, and it could be gone in an instant. He had learned that lesson too many times to forget it. So he stayed quiet, careful, invisible. But even invisibility has a cost. Sometimes, the nights grew long and heavy, the silence almost too thick to breathe. Jack would sit alone, the dim light casting his shadow across the wall, and wonder what it had all been for. The power, the money, the connections, they had all faded like smoke. What remained were memories, some sharp as glass, others blurred by time. And beneath it all, a single unspoken truth, the streets never really let go of those who once belonged to them. They lived inside you, even when you tried to forget. Despite the ghosts, Jack felt no regret, only understanding. Life had been a chessboard, and he had played his part. He had won some games, lost others, but the real victory was survival. He had escaped the traps that consumed men more ruthless than him. He had seen the end of his story before it was written. In that sense, exile wasn't punishment, it was mercy. Sometimes, as the sun set and the sky turned gold over Havana, Jack would stand by the shore, the breeze carrying the scent of salt and rum. He'd close his eyes and let the past drift through his mind, faces, laughter, danger, betrayal, all blending into one long, endless rhythm. And somewhere in that rhythm, he found meaning. He had lived a life few could imagine, walked paths most couldn't survive, and though the world had turned him into a myth, the truth was far simpler: he was just a man who had learned to live without illusions. The kind of man who understood that peace wasn't found in redemption, it was found in acceptance. And so, under the fading light of another Caribbean evening, Haitian Jack inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, and let the moment stretch into forever. For the first time in a long time, the world felt still. Not silent out of fear, but silent out of understanding. The kind of silence only earned by a man who had seen everything, lost everything, and still somehow found the will to keep breathing. The rhythm of the island had changed, and so had Haitian Jack. The days no longer felt like exile, they felt like borrowed time. There was a calmness to his life now, one that had taken decades to earn. But as the saying goes, peace makes a man think, and thinking can be its own kind of punishment. In the quiet corners of his Havana home, Jack began to revisit the choices that had shaped him. Not with regret, he didn't believe in that, but with a strange sort of curiosity, as if examining the life of someone else. He had always been a man of contradictions. Ruthless yet loyal. Charismatic yet cold. A man who could smile while plotting his next move, who could show kindness one moment and vengeance the next. That balance, that duality, was what had kept him alive in a world built on betrayal. But now, stripped of power and fear, those contradictions had nowhere to hide. They lived in his thoughts, whispering at night, echoing through his memories like unfinished conversations. Sometimes, when he walked through the crowded streets of Havana, he caught glimpses of his past reflected in others. A young hustler leaning against a wall, eyes sharp and restless. A woman laughing too loudly, masking her pain with charm. An old man playing dominoes, watching everything but saying nothing. Each one reminded him of a different chapter of his life. It was like walking through a living museum of all the people he had once been. He would sit by the ocean in the evenings, cigar smoke curling into the humid air, and think about the word respect. It had been everything once, the currency that defined your worth. In the streets, respect was life. It was more valuable than money, more powerful than fame. But as he grew older, Jack realized that most of what people called respect was really just fear wearing a different name. They didn't respect me, he once muttered to himself. They feared what I could do. That's not the same thing. He had learned the hard way that fear fades, but true respect, the kind born from understanding, from restraint, lasts longer. And maybe that's what he had been chasing all along, without ever realizing it. Not validation from others, but respect for himself. The ability to look in the mirror and not see a monster or a legend, just a man who had played the hand he was dealt. One evening, while sitting in a small Havana bar, a stranger approached him. The man was in his late 20s, wearing an oversized gold chain and a baseball cap tilted just right. He introduced himself as a musician from Miami, said he'd grown up hearing stories about Haitian Jack. They talk about you like a ghost, the young man said, eyes wide. Like you were untouchable. I had to see if you were real. Jack smiled faintly. You believe everything you hear? He asked. The musician laughed nervously. Not everything, he replied. But most of it. They talked for hours. The young man asked questions about the old days, about Tupac, about the clubs, about what it was really like when the streets ran the music industry. Jack answered some, dodged others. He wasn't trying to rewrite history, he was just trying not to let it trap him again. When the man asked him what advice he'd give to the new generation, Jack leaned forward, his voice low and steady. Don't mistake noise for power, he said. And never let fame convince you you're untouchable. That's when it all falls apart. The words lingered between them, heavy and true. The young man nodded, clearly affected. You ever miss it? He asked quietly. Jack took a long drag from his cigar before answering. Sometimes, he said. But I don't miss who I had to be to survive it. After that night, the musician left, and Jack never saw him again. But that conversation stayed with him. It reminded him of something he had almost forgotten, that even legends grow old, but the lessons they carry can outlive them. He had become something of a myth to the world, but in moments like that, he felt more like a teacher than a ghost. Still, the past never let go completely. Every once in a while, an old name would resurface, a rumor, an article, a voice from years gone by. Some were gone now, buried by time or bullets. Others were still alive, telling their own versions of the truth. Jack had stopped caring which versions people believed. The truth was a mosaic anyway, made up of broken pieces, each one shaped by memory and motive. There were nights when he'd dream of Brooklyn, the cracked sidewalks, the neon reflections on wet asphalt, the laughter echoing through the chaos. The dreams always felt real, vivid enough to make him believe, for a few moments, that he was back there. Then he'd wake up to the sound of waves and distant salsa music, and reality would return. The streets were gone, but the rhythm remained inside him. He had come to realize that identity isn't something you escape, it's something you learn to live with. He would always be Haitian Jack, the man from the shadows, the name whispered in songs and stories. But he was also just Jacques Agnant, the boy from Haiti, the immigrant, the survivor. The world might never separate the two, but in his heart, he finally could. One afternoon, while watching the sun sink below the horizon, he wrote a simple line in his notebook: "Power fades. Stories don't." It was the truest thing he'd ever written. The world would keep telling his story long after he was gone, shaping it, twisting it, adding to it. But maybe that was the point. Maybe immortality wasn't about being understood, it was about being remembered. And as the sky turned gold and the first stars appeared, Haitian Jack leaned back in his chair, exhaling a slow breath. For once, he didn't feel the need to correct the past or rewrite his legend. He had lived it. That was enough. As the years passed, Haitian Jack's name began to fade from the headlines, but not from the streets. In the world he had once ruled, legends never truly died, they just became stories told in whispers, traded in dimly lit studios and late-night conversations. Rappers, producers, and hustlers still spoke his name with a strange mix of fear and admiration. Some called him a villain. Others, a misunderstood genius. And somewhere between those two extremes lay the truth, a man shaped by loyalty, betrayal, and survival. In exile, Jack had become something else, a symbol. To some, he was the cautionary tale of what happens when the streets and fame collide. To others, he was proof that a man could outsmart the system, walk through fire, and live to tell about it. He didn't seek that reputation anymore, but he understood it. After all, stories were the only kind of immortality men like him ever got. Sometimes, when he turned on the TV or scrolled through the news, he'd catch a glimpse of his own past reflected in the new generation, the same hunger, the same recklessness, the same blindness to consequences. Young rappers still rapped about loyalty and power, but few of them understood the cost. Jack would shake his head, a faint smile curling at his lips. "They think it's all glamour," he'd murmur. "They don't know it ends with blood or prison." Always. He had seen too many young men fall chasing the illusion of invincibility. In his day, the streets were a chessboard, you survived by thinking 5 moves ahead. But now, everything was faster, louder, more reckless. Social media had replaced word of mouth, and respect had turned into likes and views. Back then, Jack once told a friend over a drink, "Your reputation came from what you did. Now it comes from what you post." He laughed softly after saying it, but his eyes carried a deep sadness. The code he'd lived by, for better or worse, was gone. Still, a part of him admired their boldness. He saw the same spark in them that had driven him once, the desire to be seen, to be known, to escape the limits of poverty and invisibility. But he also knew how dangerous that spark could become. "Power's a drug," he'd say. "You start chasing it, and before long, you forget who you are. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent most of his life chasing the same thing: power, influence, respect, and it had cost him almost everything. But he had survived, and in his survival, he'd found something unexpected: clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes after losing everything you thought mattered. One evening, while sitting on his balcony overlooking the Caribbean, a journalist came to visit. She was writing a book about the golden age of East Coast hip-hop and wanted to hear the real story. Jack hesitated at first. He had refused countless interviews over the years. He didn't trust people to tell the truth. But something about her tone was different. She wasn't there to sensationalize him, she wanted to understand him. They talked for hours. She asked about his time in Brooklyn, about the artists he had known, about the rumors that had followed him for decades. For the first time in years, Jack opened up, not to defend himself, but to give context. "Everyone thinks they know what happened," he said quietly. "But none of them were there when it mattered. None of them saw how fast it all turned." The journalist listened carefully, taking notes but rarely interrupting. When she finally asked if he regretted anything, he paused for a long moment. "Regret?" he repeated, almost amused. "No. I made choices. Some good, some bad. But every one of them made me who I am. You can't regret survival." Before leaving, she asked him one last question: "How do you want people to remember you?" Jack smiled faintly, gazing out at the sea. "As a man who understood the game," he said. "Not the stories, not the headlines, the real game. That's all." After she left, he sat alone for a while, thinking about his answer. Maybe it was true, or maybe it was just the story he'd chosen to believe. Either way, it brought him peace. He had spent his life mastering the art of survival, and now, in his quiet exile, he was mastering something harder: acceptance. The nights in Havana grew longer, the air heavier with memory. But instead of being haunted by his past, Jack learned to make peace with it. He'd pour himself a glass of rum, sit under the soft hum of a ceiling fan, and listen to old records from the 90s, the era that had both made and destroyed him. As the beats echoed through his small apartment, he'd close his eyes and smile. He wasn't chasing power anymore. He was chasing understanding. There was a time when he believed he'd be remembered as a myth. But now, he didn't care if the world forgot his name. What mattered was that he had lived it all: every triumph, every mistake, every lesson written in blood and silence. The streets might move on, the legends might fade, but for Haitian Jack, the legacy was already sealed. It wasn't in the fame or the fear, it was in the truth of having survived a world that wasn't built to let men like him grow old. In the years following his exile, the legend of Haitian Jack refused to die. In fact, it grew, twisting and reshaping itself through documentaries, interviews, and rap lyrics. He had become a ghost that still walked among the living, a name invoked whenever conversations turned to the dangerous intersection of hip-hop and the streets. In a world where myth often overshadows memory, Jack's name carried both weight and contradiction. Some saw him as a kingmaker, others as a traitor. And yet, no one could deny his influence. Even from thousands of miles away, his presence still loomed over the industry he had once helped shape. He watched from afar as new artists borrowed from his legacy, wearing danger like a designer label. Every time a rapper boasted about being connected, every time a lyric mentioned betrayal, loyalty, or the cost of fame, Jack could see his own reflection staring back. But what the world didn't see was the quiet man behind the myth. The one who woke up before dawn, walked along the humid Havana streets, and thought about how his name had outlived the person he used to be. Sometimes, he wondered whether his story had become too big to be real anymore. People told tales of him pulling strings behind the scenes, manipulating power, even orchestrating events from exile. None of it was true, but Jack understood how the streets worked. "People don't want the truth," he once said in a rare phone conversation with an old friend from Brooklyn. "They want a story." something they can feel. And his story, his legend, had become a mirror for the fantasies and fears of a whole generation. There was something almost poetic about that. Once upon a time, he had lived by the code of the streets, a code that rewarded reputation above all else. Now that same reputation had turned into a myth that refused to die, feeding off every rumor, every line, every retelling. Jack didn't fight it. He let it live on its own terms. Let them talk, he'd say. As long as they're still talking, I'm still alive. But the truth was, the legend and the man had long since diverged. The real Jack wasn't the ruthless manipulator that so many songs portrayed. He was quieter now, almost philosophical. He spent his mornings in a small cafe, sipping strong Cuban coffee while reading newspapers that mentioned his name in passing. The irony always made him smile. He was being studied like a figure from history, dissected by journalists who hadn't even been born when his story began. He had received letters over the years, some from old associates, others from young men who idolized him. They asked for advice, or sometimes forgiveness. "How did you do it?" they'd write. "How did you survive when everyone else fell?" Jack rarely responded, but when he did, his answers were short and honest. "By knowing when to disappear," he'd write. "And by never believing my own legend." One night, an old hip-hop producer called him from Los Angeles. They hadn't spoken in over a decade. The producer was working on a documentary about the early 90s, the era when hip-hop and street politics collided like fire and gasoline. He wanted Jack's blessing to tell the story properly. "You know they'll tell it with or without you," the producer said. Jack chuckled softly. "Then let them," he replied. "My part's been told enough times already." But when the documentary finally aired, Jack couldn't help but watch. The screen flickered with grainy footage of a younger version of himself, sharp suits, piercing eyes, and that trademark confidence that made people listen when he spoke. He looked like a man who believed he could control the world. Watching it now, Jack felt something between pride and sorrow. That guy, he whispered, he thought he had all the answers. The documentary reignited conversations across social media. Younger fans, who had only known his name through lyrics and rumors, began to dig deeper. They debated who he really was, a villain, a visionary, or a victim of circumstance. Jack didn't interfere. He just watched, amused, as the world rediscovered him once more. The myth was evolving again, part truth, part fiction, all emotion. But beneath the noise, Jack knew the reality. His life had been a series of crossroads, each choice shaping his destiny in ways he couldn't undo. Power had given him everything, and taken even more. "You can't live in the fire and not get burned," he'd once told a local friend who asked about his past. "But if you survive the flames, you learn how to walk through smoke." That smoke had followed him for decades. Yet now, in the twilight of his life, he found something he'd never had before: stillness. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. He didn't need to win. The same man who had once ruled rooms with silence now found peace in it. When the nights got quiet and the wind carried faint sounds from the city, Jack would sit on his balcony and listen. Somewhere in the distance, a car would pass, a song would play, a name would be spoken, and for a moment, the legend would feel alive again. What made Haitian Jack truly fascinating was not his crimes or his connections, but his survival. He had endured betrayal, exile, and erasure. Yet his name still echoed in the corners of culture. He represented something deeper, the truth that the streets never forget their architects. Even when time moves on, and the world changes its rhythm, some names remain carved into the walls of memory. Haitian Jack was one of them. In the end, he understood that legends don't belong to the people who live them, they belong to those who tell them. And as long as the world kept retelling his story, in songs, documentaries, and whispers, he would remain both everywhere and nowhere, a man who once knew everyone and trusted no one. There are few things more haunting than being remembered for the wrong reasons. For Haitian Jack, that became his quiet burden. By the time the 2010s rolled around, he had spent years away from the chaos that had once defined him. The loud nights of New York, the flashing lights of clubs, the constant tension between fame and danger, all of it had been replaced by slow mornings, ocean air, and a kind of peace that felt both foreign and fragile. Yet no matter how far he went, his past always found a way to reach him. The world had moved on, but it hadn't forgotten. New documentaries were being made about Tupac, about the golden age of hip-hop, about the street figures who shaped an era, and inevitably, Jack's name would surface. His story was too tangled in the mythology of that time to ever be left out. But what frustrated him wasn't being mentioned, it was being misunderstood. Every retelling painted him as something different, a puppet master, a villain, a misunderstood street philosopher. He had become a reflection of whatever story people needed him to be. He'd watch these retellings on late-night television, a soft grin forming on his face. "They're still talking," he'd say to himself, his voice carrying both pride and disbelief. Sometimes, he'd even recognize faces from the past, rappers, producers, journalists, each spinning their version of the truth. Some of them owed him their start. Others owed him apologies. But time had a way of making everything look cleaner, simpler. The betrayals, the violence, the paranoia, all of it now packaged neatly as history. But to Jack, it wasn't history, it was life. He still remembered the smell of the Brooklyn streets after rain, the way people's eyes darted when they heard his name, the weight of silence before a deal was made or a betrayal revealed. The world could romanticize it, but Jack had lived the chaos firsthand. He had seen how quickly loyalty turned into fear, and how power could rot even the strongest hearts. And yet, in that quiet life of exile, Jack began to see his own story differently. He no longer viewed himself as the protagonist of a tragedy or the mastermind of a legend. He began to see himself as a survivor of circumstances too volatile to control. "You can't blame the fire for burning," he once said to a young Cuban musician who idolized him. "You just have to learn not to stand too close." That young musician would often visit Jack, drawn by the stories he told, not the ones about violence, but the ones about survival. They would sit for hours, talking about music, ambition, and the fine line between success and destruction. Jack spoke softly, his voice almost hypnotic. "Fame is a mirror," he said once. "It shows you what you want to see, but never what's real." Those conversations gave Jack something he hadn't expected, a sense of purpose. For the first time, he wasn't chasing influence, he was sharing perspective. The streets had taken enough from him, but perhaps he could give something back in return, wisdom, the kind that could only come from making every possible mistake and living long enough to understand it. At night, he often sat outside, a small radio playing faint hip-hop beats from the mainland. When he heard newer artists mention his name in their lyrics, he'd smile. Some of them got the story wrong, but that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the echo of his life still resonated. Through time, he had become part of a cultural bloodstream, his name, his style, his code, embedded into the DNA of hip-hop itself. But fame, even second-hand fame, came with its ghosts. There were nights when Jack would lie awake, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above him, and think of the faces that didn't make it. Tupac, Biggie, countless others. "We were all playing a game we didn't understand," he'd whisper. And some of us never got to stop playing. The guilt lingered, not for what he'd done, but for having survived when others hadn't. In those quiet moments, he began keeping a journal. Not for publication, not for fame, but for himself. He wrote about the lessons he'd learned, the difference between respect and fear, between loyalty and control. His handwriting was deliberate, steady, as if each word were a form of penance. "The streets," he wrote one night, "never teach you how to stop fighting. You have to teach yourself." Over time, those journal pages became a kind of therapy. Through them, he began to separate Haitian Jack, the myth, from Jacques Agnant, the man. It was a slow reconciliation, one born not from regret, but from understanding. You can't outrun your story, he once told a friend over the phone. But you can stop letting it write the ending. That ending, for Jack, was not going to be another tragedy. He had made peace with the idea that he would never be fully understood. The world needed its myths, and he had become one of them, half truth, half cautionary tale. But for the first time, he no longer felt trapped by that identity. He was free in a way that fame and fear had never allowed. As dawn broke over the Caribbean horizon, Jack would often watch the sunrise with a quiet smile. The sea, endless and calm, reminded him of everything he had survived. He was no longer the man who ruled the streets of Brooklyn. He was something rarer, a man who had seen the depths of power, betrayal, and loss, and found peace on the other side. And maybe that, in the end, was his real legacy, not the legend whispered in dark corners or immortalized in lyrics, but the fact that he had endured, transformed, and lived long enough to become his own redemption story. The older he got, the more Haitian Jack realized that survival wasn't about outsmarting everyone, it was about learning to live with yourself once the noise faded. There were no entourages anymore, no flashing lights, no phone calls in the middle of the night demanding answers or loyalty. Life had slowed to a rhythm that was almost meditative. The chaos that once followed him had dissolved into memory, leaving behind a silence he had once feared but now welcomed. For the first time, he was living not for control, not for power, but for understanding. It was during those quiet Havana mornings that reflection became routine. Jack would sit by the window with a cup of coffee, the air thick with the scent of salt and tobacco. From there, he could see fishermen setting out before sunrise, their silhouettes moving through a haze of gold and blue. It reminded him of Brooklyn mornings long ago, back when ambition had been his only compass. Back then, he believed that control was everything. That being feared was safer than being forgotten. But now, he saw how wrong he'd been. Fear could build empires, but it couldn't give you peace. He thought often about the people who had crossed his path, artists, dealers, friends, enemies. Some had become legends, others ghosts. Each had shaped him in ways he hadn't recognized at the time. He had learned from their loyalty, their betrayal, their ambition, their downfall. Every lesson was carved into his memory, a map of mistakes that had brought him here. You don't see the wisdom in pain until you stop running from it, he'd once said to a local friend. When you finally face it, you realize pain was the teacher all along. In many ways, Jack had become something of a quiet philosopher in exile. People came to him, not out of fear or respect, but curiosity. Local hustlers, young musicians, and even tourists who had heard whispers about the legend who used to run with Tupac. They'd find him in a small Havana cafe, seated at the same corner table every day, his gold chain hidden beneath a linen shirt, his demeanor calm but commanding. He didn't boast or reminisce. He just listened. And when he spoke, his words carried the weight of lived truth. One day, a young filmmaker from New York visited him. The man was making a documentary on the unsung architects of hip-hop culture and wanted Jack's perspective. Jack hesitated at first. He had avoided the camera for years, preferring to live in the shadows. But something about the filmmaker's sincerity convinced him. "You really want the truth?" Jack asked, his voice steady but distant. "Because the truth isn't glamorous. It's lonely. It's messy. And it doesn't rhyme with the beat." The filmmaker nodded, and for the first time in years, Jack allowed himself to tell his story, not the myth, not the rumor, but the raw, unfiltered truth. He spoke of the early days in Brooklyn, of hustling not for fame but survival, of the intoxicating rush of power and the creeping shadow of paranoia. He talked about loyalty that turned into betrayal, about trust that became currency, and about how easy it was to lose your soul chasing respect. When the interview ended, the filmmaker sat in stunned silence. "Do you regret any of it?" he finally asked. Jack smiled faintly. "Regret's a luxury," he said. "The streets don't give you that. You just learn and move on. The trick isn't to erase your past, it's to understand it. A few months later, when the documentary was released, it painted Jack not as a villain or a saint, but as something more human, a survivor who had lived through the storm and emerged with wisdom carved into his scars. The reception surprised him. People spoke about him differently now. The same audiences who once feared him now spoke of him with respect, even empathy. He was more than the headlines, one reviewer wrote. He was the reflection of a time when the line between art and the streets disappeared. Jack read that line several times, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. Maybe, for once, his story had been told the right way, not as a myth, but as a man's truth. But even that small redemption didn't change his rhythm. He continued his life in Havana much the same way, quiet, observant, detached from fame but aware of its lingering shadow. Some nights, he'd walk along the beach under the moonlight, his feet sinking into the cool sand. The sea whispered softly, a reminder of how far he'd come and how much had changed. The same man who once orchestrated street politics in New York now found peace in solitude. Funny thing about power, he'd murmur, you spend your life chasing it, and when you finally lose it, that's when you learn what freedom really is. He was still careful, though. Old instincts die hard. Even in peace, Jack stayed alert, always scanning faces, always aware of exits. It wasn't paranoia anymore, just a habit born from survival. The streets had trained him to see the world differently, and even time couldn't unteach that. But unlike before, it didn't consume him. It just reminded him of who he was, and who he'd chosen to become. In his final years in Havana, Jack began to appreciate something he'd never understood before, the beauty of being forgotten. Fame, he realized, had been his curse. Everyone wanted to know Haitian Jack, but no one ever wanted to know Jacques Agnant. Now, in the anonymity of his quiet life, he was finally free to be both. He could walk through a crowd without whispers, sit in a cafe without stares, live without performance. And perhaps, in the grand story of his life, that was his greatest victory. He had escaped the cycle, the violence, the betrayal, the hunger for power, and found something the streets could never give him, peace without fear. Respect without reputation, and a sense of self that no legend could define. When people spoke his name now, it wasn't with dread or speculation. It was with intrigue. A mystery that had survived time. Haitian Jack, the man who had known everyone, trusted no one, and lived to tell the tale. By the time the world had all but forgotten him, Haitian Jack had already made peace with his own obscurity. The noise of fame had faded, replaced by something far more precious, stillness. He had lived through eras that devoured men whole, through betrayals that could have broken anyone else. Yet somehow, he had endured. The years had softened him, not in strength, but in purpose. What had once been survival had transformed into reflection. What had once been rage had become understanding. On most days, Jack's life followed a calm routine. He'd rise with the sun, the sound of waves carrying through the window of his small apartment in Havana. The city woke slowly, street vendors setting up stalls, children chasing each other through narrow alleys, the scent of roasted coffee and saltwater mingling in the air. It was far removed from the New York he once ruled, the flashing lights, the ceaseless motion, the noise that never stopped. Havana had rhythm too, but it was slower, like a heartbeat that had finally found its balance. Sometimes he would sit at a small cafe near the Malecon, watching the tide crash against the worn stone wall. The locals called him El Silencioso, the quiet one. Most didn't know who he really was, and that suited him fine. For the first time in decades, anonymity felt like freedom. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't proving anything. He was simply existing, and that, to him, was a luxury. But every now and then, a stranger would recognize him. Usually, it was someone from the hip-hop world, an artist passing through Havana, a journalist, a producer chasing nostalgia. They would approach hesitantly, unsure if the man before them was truly the legend they'd heard about. And when they asked, "Are you Haitian Jack?" he would simply smile, neither confirming nor denying. That name, he'd say softly, belongs to another life. Yet, beneath that calm exterior, memories still stirred. Some nights, when the streets grew quiet and the wind carried faint echoes from distant bars, Jack would pour himself a drink and let his mind wander back through time. He could still see the faces, Tupac's charisma, Biggie's laughter, the sharp edge of a New York night in the 1990s when anything could happen. He'd think about the choices that had defined him, the lines crossed, the friendships that had turned into feuds. And though the memories carried pain, they no longer haunted him. They had become part of his rhythm, like background music to a story already told. He often said that people misunderstood the streets. "They think it's about money or respect," he told a young Cuban poet once. "But it's really about survival. The rest is just decoration." He spoke not with pride, but with the quiet wisdom of someone who had paid the price for understanding too late. That poet would later write a piece about him, not as a gangster or a myth, but as a man who had outlived his own legend. The poem ended with a line Jack never forgot: "He walked through fire and came out smoke." There was something deeply poetic about that, becoming smoke, intangible yet ever-present. Jack had become exactly that, a presence that could not be seen, only felt. His story had turned into folklore, carried by voices who never met him, told in lyrics and rumors, reshaped again and again. But what those stories missed was the man who sat quietly by the sea, tracing the horizon with his eyes, finally at peace with the chaos that had once defined him. When he looked back, Jack didn't romanticize his past. He saw it for what it was, a series of choices made by a man trying to survive in a world that punished weakness. He had played the game better than most, but he understood now that the game had no winners. Power, he once mused aloud, is just another word for debt. You spend your life owing it something. That clarity had come slowly, through years of isolation and introspection. He no longer sought redemption, he didn't believe in it. Instead, he sought understanding, a quiet acceptance of his story's weight. Every scar, every rumor, every betrayal had brought him here, to this quiet corner of the world where he could finally exhale. But even in that peace, there were moments when the past would whisper to him. A certain song on the radio, a headline mentioning his name, or a photograph from the old days would stir something deep inside. It wasn't regret, it was recognition. The realization that he had lived a life so intense that even silence carried its echo. In those moments, he would sometimes take out a small, worn notebook, the one he had kept over the years. Inside were pages filled with reflections, names, lessons. Some pages were smudged with age, others carefully written. On one page, near the end, he had written a single line: "The streets gave me everything, and then they took it back. What's left is mine to keep." That line, in many ways, summed up Haitian Jack's existence. He had lived in extremes, love and betrayal, fame and exile, myth and man. And now, in his final chapter, he found solace not in rewriting the past, but in owning it completely. The sun would set over the Caribbean, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, and Jack would sit on his balcony, the hum of Havana fading into the background. Somewhere out there, people were still telling his story, sometimes true, sometimes not. But it didn't matter anymore. The legend could belong to them. The piece, finally, belonged to him. As the years continued to roll by, whispers about Haitian Jack began to resurface in the underground circles of New York and Los Angeles. He had become a ghost, not the kind that haunts places, but the kind that lingers in conversations, in music, in myths. Younger rappers, who had never even met him, spoke his name in awe, as though invoking a spirit from a time when the streets still had a code. They imagined him as a ruthless gangster, a shadow who moved through the industry with silent precision. But the truth, as always, was far more complex. Haitian Jack had long understood that reputation was both a crown and a curse. The more people talked about him, the less they really knew. The real man behind the myth had faded into a kind of living anonymity. In the dim glow of Havana's nightclubs, he would sometimes watch tourists rap along to songs that referenced him, Tupac's "Against All Odds," or whispers of his name in documentaries, and he'd shake his head with a quiet smile. It was strange, he thought, to be both alive and already a legend. The world that had once revolved around money, fame, and power now felt distant, almost unreal. The flashy nights at Club 662, the tense meetings in back rooms, the paranoia of knowing that any friend could turn into an informant, all of it had blurred into fragments of another lifetime. And yet, there was a certain comfort in knowing he had outlasted it all. The rivals, the cops, even the culture itself had moved on, but Jack was still here, breathing, watching, remembering. Occasionally, an old associate would find him. They'd arrive in Havana with a bottle of rum and a dozen unspoken questions. "How did you survive?" they'd ask. "How did you get out?" Jack would just shrug. "I stopped playing the game," he'd say simply. "The trick isn't winning, it's walking away before it kills you." There was a depth to his tone that only those who had lived that life could understand. What many didn't realize was that Jack had always been a thinker beneath the toughness. He could read people like open books, predict moves before they were made. That instinct had saved his life more than once, and now, it kept him alive in a quieter way, navigating not the streets, but the delicate balance of peace and memory. He often compared his old life to a chessboard. "The streets teach you the same thing chess does," he'd say to a young hustler once visiting Cuba. "You sacrifice pawns to protect your king. The problem is, most of us never realize we are the pawns." Despite his solitude, he was never lonely. The city itself seemed to keep him company. The sound of the ocean, the hum of laughter in distant alleys, the rhythm of drums on the streets during festivals, they filled the spaces that used to echo with gunfire and betrayal. Life had traded chaos for simplicity, and Jack had learned to appreciate that trade. There was no entourage, no expensive cars, no flashing cameras. Just silence, peace, and the occasional conversation that reminded him he was still remembered. Yet the weight of his past never truly left him. It lived inside him like an old scar, healed, but never forgotten. Sometimes, he would wake before dawn, unable to sleep, and walk along the coastline until the first light broke over the horizon. He said it helped him think. He wasn't seeking forgiveness, he had made peace with his sins long ago, but there was a certain clarity that came from facing them every morning. "You can't outrun what you've done," he once told a local bartender. "But you can learn to live with the echo." He had seen too many of his old friends die chasing immortality, some in gunfights, some in prison cells, others consumed by paranoia and greed. That was the tragedy of the streets, it promised power but delivered graves. Jack had simply been smart enough, or perhaps lucky enough, to step away before his name was carved into stone. But even then, he knew that survival came with its own burden, the guilt of being one of the few left to remember how it all ended. Every now and then, a journalist or filmmaker would reach out, hoping for an interview. They wanted the real story, the truth behind the myths. But Jack always refused. The truth, he'd tell them, isn't what you can print. It's what you can't understand. He wasn't protecting himself anymore, he was protecting the sanctity of memory. Because to tell the story would be to reopen wounds that no one else had earned the right to feel. In private, though, Jack sometimes wrote. Just notes, fragments of thoughts. Pieces of wisdom he had gathered over decades of chaos. One page read, "Power without peace is prison." Another, "Loyalty is the rarest currency." These scribbles weren't meant for publication or fame. They were for him, a way to leave behind a map of his own redemption. As time went on, his body began to slow, but his mind remained sharp. He had become something of a local mystery, a quiet old man who tipped well, read philosophy, and occasionally disappeared for weeks at a time. Nobody really knew what he did during those absences, but those who paid attention noticed that he always came back calmer, more at ease, as if he had been visiting ghosts from his past and putting them to rest one by one. In the end, Haitian Jack's life had come full circle. From the dangerous streets of Brooklyn to the tranquil shores of Havana, his story was a meditation on survival, not the loud, cinematic kind, but the quiet survival of a man who refused to be defined by his mistakes. His name still floated through hip-hop, still sparked debates online, but to Jack, those were just echoes. The real victory was invisible: peace, anonymity, and the simple act of waking up each morning without fear. As the night breeze brushed against his face one evening, he whispered something almost to himself, though no one was around to hear it. They told my story 100 ways, but none of them ever knew me. He smiled faintly, took another sip of his drink, and looked out at the horizon. For a man who had once lived like a storm, it was fitting that he ended his days in the calm after it. In the quiet twilight of his years, Haitian Jack's story took on a new dimension, not as a tale of crime or chaos, but as a meditation on the price of survival. The name that once sent ripples through the streets of Brooklyn and echoed in the lyrics of Tupac Shakur had become a whisper carried by time. To those who still spoke it, it was half myth, half warning, a legend built on both brilliance and blood. But for the man himself, far removed from the noise of his past, the meaning of that name had changed. It was no longer about fear or power. It was about endurance, about the strange peace that comes when the world finally stops chasing you. In the soft Caribbean evenings of Havana, Jack often sat on the balcony of a small apartment overlooking the worn cobblestone streets. The scent of sea salt and tobacco hung in the air, mingling with faint laughter from distant cafes. He had found a rhythm in the simplicity of things: a cup of coffee in the morning, a walk through the markets, the music that drifted through the air like memory. Sometimes, children would play soccer in the alley below, unaware that the quiet old man watching them had once been one of the most feared figures in American street lore. He rarely spoke of the past, but when he did, it was never with pride, only reflection. "I used to think respect was the same as love," he'd say softly. "But respect fades the moment you're gone. Love doesn't." Those who met him in his later years often found it hard to reconcile the calm, thoughtful man before them with the stories they had heard, the whispered rumors of intimidation, the volatile temper, the countless alliances and betrayals. But Jack had learned that everyone carries two lives, the one people talk about, and the one that lives quietly inside. Sometimes, when the night grew too still, he'd think about the faces that had disappeared, the friends buried young, the rivals lost to bullets or prison. In those moments, the weight of survival pressed down like a heavy fog. To live past your era was both a blessing and a curse. It meant you'd outlasted the noise, but it also meant living as the last witness to a time that no longer existed. The streets he once ruled had changed, the code he once followed was gone. The loyalty, the hierarchy, the twisted sense of honor that governed the underworld, all had been replaced by a new generation that didn't even know the rules they were breaking. And yet, there was something almost poetic in that change. Jack had once lived by a code of silence, of strategy, of survival. Now, silence was his peace. The same instinct that had taught him when to disappear had saved his life. Where others had chased the spotlight, he had learned to step out of it. That was the irony of his legacy: he had become immortal precisely because he had vanished. In Havana, he sometimes met travelers, writers, musicians, dreamers, who recognized him and wanted to hear the truth. But he would smile and change the subject. "You already know the story," he'd tell them. "You just don't know what it cost." And that was the part no one could ever really understand. The cost of power wasn't just enemies or arrests. It was sleepless nights. It was the paranoia that stayed long after the danger was gone. It was realizing that trust, the one thing he could never find, might have saved him from himself. Yet for all the darkness in his past, there was still light in how he looked at the world. He had learned gratitude. He was grateful for the mornings he woke without sirens. Grateful for anonymity, for the ability to walk through a market unnoticed. Grateful that his story, no matter how misunderstood, still lived on in whispers, in verses, in the quiet reverence of those who admired his survival more than his sins. One evening, a young Cuban man, a fan of American hip-hop, approached him at a bar. The man was nervous, almost reverent. "Are you really him?" he asked. Jack looked up, smiled faintly, and nodded. The young man hesitated, then said, "They call you a legend." Jack chuckled. "A legend," he said, swirling his drink. "Legends are just stories people tell to make sense of what they don't understand." He paused, staring into the amber liquid. "The truth is, I was just a man trying not to drown." That was the essence of Haitian Jack. Beneath all the myths and headlines, he was a man who refused to be broken by the tide. He had lived through eras of danger, betrayal, and survival, and yet here he was, older, quieter, wiser. The fire was still there, but it burned softly now, like a candle instead of a wildfire. As the years continued to pass, his presence in Havana became almost ghostly. Some said he moved to another country. Others swore they saw him walking the beach at dawn, disappearing into the mist. Whether true or not, it felt fitting. The man who had mastered the art of disappearing had, once again, slipped through the cracks of the world. But even in absence, his name lived on. In lyrics. In documentaries. In street conversations that began with, "You know about Haitian Jack." To many, he symbolized the duality of the streets, the brilliance and the brutality, the glamour and the grief. To others, he was a cautionary tale. A man who gained everything but learned too late what really mattered. And in that duality lies the beauty of his story. It is both a legend of survival and a lament for everything that survival costs. In the end, there are no dramatic conclusions, no cinematic deaths, no sudden redemption arcs. Just a quiet fade into history. The waves keep rolling, the world keeps moving, and Haitian Jack becomes what all legends eventually become, a story that belongs to time more than to truth. Yet if you listen closely, in the late hours of the night, when the city is still and the wind carries faint echoes from the past, you might hear a whisper, the voice of a man who knew everyone and trusted no one, reminding you that sometimes the greatest victory is simply surviving long enough to tell the tale.